Is everybody doing all right? Did you have a good week? A number of things. Well, so many things came up last week, and I welcome, at some point, there'll be an opportunity to address any loose ends or things that were said last week that stayed with you. To refresh your memory, we talked religion as controlling story. Religion, religar, the lig in there, like the lig in obligation, is a tie, a bond, a knot. So I'm trying to argue that religion is non-optional, like culture is non-optional. And to say, when we discover that there was a Bible on the scene, or that the suspect was seen at a church or a mosque, and to then say, of whatever event, religion was involved. Religion played a role. Religion made an appearance, is a little like saying language was involved. Culture played a role. You're not going to believe this, but someone saw relationship while it was happening, kind of thing. So I think religion, and we had a poem, which I passed out, and if you need another copy of that, I can give it to you. But the poem attempted to let religion, for the sake of being clear, to let religion be value neutral, as a concept, as an abstraction. To me, saying I'm against religion is a little like saying I'm against the forming of lines at Starbucks. I don't like it when that happens. I don't like it when cultural formations occur. And to say I'm for religion, I want more religion, would be a little like saying I want more stories, I want more promises, I want more cults even. I want more mass action in a way. So, to be clear, I don't mean to argue for or against religion. I just mean to acknowledge religion as being as inevitably human as songs, stories, lyrics, unifying ideas type stuff. Does this make sense to everybody? And I think it's important. It's really, really important to do this, because I think when we get that wrong, or when we use the word religion as if we're describing processes that only other people are involved in, that we're really missing something. And of course, part of this too is the danger of labels. One of my big arguments is if you ever think you've gotten to the bottom with someone else, if you ever think you've gotten to the bottom of someone else through the application of an adjective, you're on blasphemous ground, or violent ground, or bullying ground, when you think you've gotten to the bottom of somebody, when you call them a fool, or an idiot, or a liberal, or a conservative. Human beings are always way more complex, way more valuable, way more worthy of reverence than we realize. I mean, and I suppose that could be called a religious insight, but it's not limited to any one religion. Maybe it's a sacred insight, or maybe it's just a good idea when you're thinking about other human beings, to believe that. To believe that when you look at another human being, that you're looking at a library of experience, wisdom. Maybe they're estranged from their wisdom. Maybe they're estranged from themselves, but you're looking at a fathomless, I mean, this is ridiculous, but on my cell phone, I didn't want my recording saying, please call back, to be anything less than thoughtful. So if you were to call me on my cell phone, I say something like, dear, infinitely valuable human being. You have reached David Dark Self. And my mother gets really upset with me because she is waiting to leave a message, and it's a pretty long one that I haven't changed yet, but I maybe need to. So infinitely valuable human beings is part of the thing too. And on this, well, I'll read one time. I will read the quote with which I ended our class last time. This is from Iris Murdoch, and it's a good guiding quote as we're thinking these things through. She says, "Love is the extremely difficult realization that something other than oneself is real. Love, and so art and morals, is the discovery of reality." And with that in mind, this idea of trying to, oh, well, goodness, even, I think love is intelligence. Maybe we could say there is no knowledge without love, or there is no seeing things clearly without love. And so on that, love is a form of intelligence. Love is a way of realizing what's happening in your own life and the lives of others. I'll say something about this labels thing. I note, so this is a bit of a build-up, I'm bummed out by the way people talk about religion. Be it an online rant, a headline, a news report, or a conversation overheard, I feel a jolt of sympathy pain whenever someone characterizes someone else as religious. It's as if a door just got slammed. A person has been somehow shrink-wrapped. Some sweet and perfectly interesting somebody is getting left out. And in a subtle, hard-to-get-a-handle-on kind of way, it's kind of like someone's been told to shut up. It happens with politics, too. You'll recall from last week the three big misconceptions of our time: religion, politics, media. All abstractions, all concepts with which we try to assert some kind of control, and more often than not, religion, politics, media, concepts with which we blame anyone other than ourselves, anyone other than our own emails, kind of thing. Every once in a while when I look at you and it's just transfixed, I'm afraid that I'm losing you. Could I just have a nod or something with you right now? Okay, so religion, politics, media, we do that. Yeah, we perhaps excuse our own behavior. We perhaps let ourselves off the ethical hook with those three abstractions. I never did it, but I was so often on that form of Antichrist called Facebook, I often wanted to say to various people, no political party made you put that on your Facebook wall. The media, whatever you make of that, didn't make you speak to your spouse that way. You can't blame. These concepts. Anyway, there we are. And so, but we're talking about religion as a label. But of course it goes into other labels. Here we go. In a subtle, hard to get a handle on kind of way, it's like someone's been told to shut up when we say, can you keep your politics out of this? Can you keep your religion out of this? It's like, well, what else is there to talk about? I mean, those are kind of the bookends of human culture. Religion, and it's understandable, I want to say, because we do need, perhaps this came up last week, but if you're in a board meeting or if you're on a school board, for instance, it is helpful that no one be allowed to play the God card to the exclusion of everyone else's opinion. It's probably important in civil discourse that one person's insistence on what God says doesn't get to trump the reasoning power of everyone else in the room. And of course we got into this a little bit last week. Bible studies go badly when only one person's interpretation of a particular verse counts. But if different interpretations are allowed, now we've got something. We've got a book club like no other. It could change the world, kind of thing. If each person if everybody really listens, and if everyone's genuinely willing to believe that a word of truth or a word of revelation can come from anyone there. That'd be a little like democracy, in a way, were that to happen. And it does happen, here and there, all the time. So when we do religion, so-and-so's religious, You don't want to talk about this in front of them. They're religious. Even then, I want to say, well, hold on, I bet there's a lot more going on than whatever you think you've shrink-wrapped when you call that person religious. But this is the way it goes with our words. When I label people, I no longer have to deal with them thoughtfully. I'll repeat that one. When I label people, I no longer have to deal with them thoughtfully. I no longer have to feel overwhelmed by their complexity, the lives they live, the dreams they have, their experiences. I know exactly where they are, inside or forever outside my field of care, my presumed field of care, because they've been taken care of with a label. The mystery of their existence has been solved and filed away before I've had a chance to be moved by them or even begun to catch a glimpse of who they might be. They've been neutralized. There's hardly any action quite so undemanding, so utterly unimaginative as the affixing of a label. It's the costliest of mental shortcuts. And of course, some of us may be well versed enough in Jewish and Christian scripture to know that Jesus of Nazareth said that when you call someone a fool or raka or an idiot, that you are in a deep sense partaking of the fires of Gehenna, hell, destruction, whenever you speak that way of someone else. So, yeah, this isn't just a let's be nice to each other. This is a sacred summons to not ever allow oneself to reduce another person to the size of our own interest. Always know that there's somebody else, something more going on. Of course, we get to call it like we see it, labels. What else can we do? But when we do so with undue haste, when we're neither remotely inquisitive nor especially curious in our regard for other people, we may find that a casual demonization comes to pepper our conversations. This is why it often seems to me that calling someone liberal, conservative, fundamentalist, atheist, godless, extremist, illegal, is to largely deal in curse words. It puts a person in what we take to be their place, but it only speaks in shorthand. When I go no further in my consideration of my fellow human, I betray my preference for caricature over perception, a shrug as opposed to a vision of the lived fact of somebody in a body. In the face of a perhaps beautifully complicated life, I've opted for oversimplification, generalization. And so it goes with the application. Okay, so I bet there's a lot to be talked about here with this label bit, but this is a bit of a transition where I'm going back to that label, religious. So it goes with the application of that impossibly broad brush called religion. It's as if we can't even speak the word without walking into the minefield of someone else's wounds. I think this came up a little bit last week. You can hardly even speak the word without walking into the minefield of someone else's wounds, because for many, especially you know, the people called millennials, the people called who, according to a Pew, we'll get into this in a couple of weeks, but have you ever heard of the nuns? The nuns? Okay, so the nuns are those who, when confronted with Christian, Jewish, Buddhist, atheist, Muslim, nun, go with none. Now there's a way of reading that, which is, oh, well, they just don't care about God, those people. No, I want to say don't do that. Don't do that. Because there is a degree of reverence there. I mean, especially, say you're Baptist or Presbyterian, but then you meet a Muslim whose pursuit of lived righteousness and neighborliness exceeds that of most Presbyterians, you know. Or say you get to reading about Christianity and you note that the entire Bible is written by Jewish people, and you get to thinking, can that strict divide between Judaism and Christianity, does that really do justice to this tradition that I mean to be a part of. So I would like to argue that, while doubtless there are those who check none and think, I'm just done with all that. It seemed to create so much pain, such a toxic environment, that it could also be that none is a refusal to limit one's witness, one's devotional life, one's ethical life to one tradition, to the exclusion of others. Does this make sense to folks? Oh, and forgive me if I repeat stories. Can't recall if this one came up last week, but there was a guy who worked at Logos Bookstore on Hillsborough Road, and I overheard him. Oh, well, you may know this guy, Marvin Paget. Anybody? Hello? Okay, so possibly Marvin Paget. Marvin Paget was getting into it with somebody who preferred to be non-denominational. And the guy said, okay, I know you're Presbyterian and proud of it, but if you couldn't be Presbyterian, what would you be? And Marvin Paget said, ashamed. Which I loved. I loved that, because to me, and I may have read him wrong, but that didn't say everybody's got to become Presbyterian. It said to me, and you know, when we're talking back and forth, you can correct me. You can say, I know Marvin Paget, I know that's not what he meant. But I thought he was saying, this is my way of seeking God's kingdom and righteousness. This is the pattern. This is the rivulet within the larger river or something. This is the flow. This is the way I'm going to do it. And I can't pretend that I think that we shouldn't baptize babies. I think we should. I'm Presbyterian. So he had his experiment, his neighborhood, his shot at transcendence, and he's sticking to it. So there's a place for that as well. But if we think, oh, this came up in a conversation on the way over here, if we think that our tradition is the only witness to God there is, I would suggest that's bad religion. Because that's suggesting, oh, well, goodness. Yeah, I mean, it's suggesting that only my tradition manages to not see through a glass darkly and goes straight to God, kind of thing. Hopefully we have an appreciation for more than one way of reading the Bible. I think there's something virtuous in that. But we can talk about it. Anyway, I'm going to keep going with this. Whenever we say religion, we doubtless walk into the minefield of someone else's wounds. Guards go up immediately and with good reason. It's the ultimate conversation stopper, an association to end all associations. It's one more label we use as a placeholder of persons and populations. Again, as if we've somehow gotten to the bottom of who they are with an adjective. I want very much to take this attitude aside and punch it lovingly in the stomach. I want good humor and candor and more truth between us than a label could ever afford. And if it's the case that mention of religion mostly shuts conversation down, I want very badly to somehow crack it open again. If we're open to it, the word need not always signal a dead end. It might even be a means to a breakthrough, a way of fessing up to the facts of what we're all up to in one way or another. And again, fessing up to the facts, I don't know if this came up, but did we talk inescapable network of mutuality last week? Okay, so Martin Luther King Jr. once said that the moment he, when he gets up in the morning, he's got orange juice, coffee, eggs, and a newspaper. And with just those, with just one of those, he said, I am already in relationship with lots of people I'm never going to see. Newspaper, coffee, orange juice, eggs, farmers, coffee bean growers, transportation, all of the people, the living people who were involved in the supply chain that gets all this to me. If all I want to know is how much I have to pay for it, I do not have a deep sense of neighborliness when it comes to the rest of the world. If I want to know that everybody who got it to me has what they need to live, given the work that they did to get this to me, now we might be seeking first God's kingdom and righteousness in our consideration of this liturgy. And of course we call lots of things liturgy, but liturgy is the work of the people. So he's already involved in liturgy. And the phrase that he gave us when he notes this, his relationship to all these people, farmers, orange growers, all that kind of thing. He said, from the moment I partake of this labor of human hands and this gift of nature, this yield of the ground, I already exist in an inescapable network of mutuality. It's a bit of a mouthful. Inescapable network of mutuality. Inescapable network of mutuality. And I love every one of those words is necessary, because when he says inescapable, he's saying there is no escape from the realm of liturgy. There's no escape from relationship. Inescapable network of mutuality, kinship, neighborliness. The farmer, poet, philosopher Wendell Berry says that he doesn't like the word environment, because when you say environment, you might fall into the trap of thinking that you can form and speak the word environment without an environment. And that gets really tricky. You can't form the word environment outside of an environment, outside of air, outside of water, outside of life. So he proposes that instead of saying environment or environmentalism, we say neighborhood, so that we note that we are in an inescapable network of mutuality. At all points, even if you're a monk in a monastery praying alone in a room, you're still in an inescapable network of mutuality, because you're existing within architecture, a room that was designed, a room that was built. So there's no getting away from people, finally. I will throw in another story and note that I had an older relative. Oh, I'm just going to go for it and tell you it was my dad. I've often said he's no longer with us, but my dad would go to family reunions, and he would go because he kind of had to, but once he got there, he would go take a nap. So he would get the credit of coming to the family reunion minus having to endure the company of anyone. And he did this regularly, where he shows up, maybe eats something, takes a nap, wakes up, leaves. It was a really insidious process, but I can relate to it. But one time he did it, and he came out of the room where he had had his nap. He saw his sister, and his sister said, "Where were you?" as they do with one another. And he would have none of it, and he said, "I was sleeping." Like, he's not going to deny what happened. And she said, "Oh." And she wasn't going to challenge that, but he was always looking for a challenge. So even though she didn't barb him in any way, he said, "And you know what I'm going to do one of these days?" And she said, "What?" And he said, "Go on sleeping." And it was just this really macabre, kind of mean thing, like, "I'm going to escape you finally one of these days." I mean, that really was behind it. But I was there, so I said to him, "And you know what's going to be there when you wake up?" And he said, "What?" I said, "More people." And I mean, that was my one little, Jean-Paul Sartre says hell is other people. I was trying to argue that heaven is other people, that there's no getting away from this inescapable network of mutuality. I don't know if I've ever tied that phrase to that story before, but I think it's appropriate. Yes. Okay, so a little bit more here. Let me read some. I will note, too, this desire to frame religion this way, as relationship, and to suggest that religion is non-optional. There's no getting away from it. Where there's people, there's religion. Where there's people, there is some story unifying those people. But there's also, if those are bad stories, there are better stories by which we escape the bad religion that we need to get past. But why insist? I'm in it for beauty. As someone who has dared to try to teach people for most of my adult life, I often suspect that what I'm up to is in large part an effort to try to stop people from becoming bored and giving up too soon, to help them find their own lives and the lives of others powerfully interesting, weird, and somehow beautiful. To look, yes. I am reading from the text of my book. And I'll note that right now I'm on page 20, if that's helpful. To look again, to respect. It was Wendell Berry who taught me to view the word respect as spectacle, to look again. And of course, respect is another one of those abstractions. Because show some respect, okay? But respect requires a context. Greatness requires a context. Content, like the word impact, I think we talked about this, impactful, I hear people say, to which I always want to say, well, what was the nature of the impact? Because an explosion is impactful. So-and-so is very influential. Hooray. What kind of influence? What kind of impact? So, but respect, what are we being asked to respect? What are we being asked to disrespect when we respect whoever or whatever that thing is that's demanding respect? So anyway, so the way I'm trying to posit religion with my little whisper campaign is an effort to live and think and see more beautifully and to recognize beauty everywhere. To look again, to respect. Stay with me and consider the possibility that there might be more going on in a neighbor, a novel, an image, or an issue than your mind grasped the first time around. So you have to look again. You have to respect, re-examine, rethink. Something worthy of your time, something beautiful. In this, I share Elaine Scarry's conviction that the willingness continually to revise one's own location in order to place oneself in the path of beauty is the basic impulse underlying education. Okay, so here's what she's doing with beauty. There's an amazing Swiss theologian called Hans Urs von Balthasar who does the same thing. And Will Campbell does the same thing. Anybody know the name Will Campbell of Mount Juliet? Okay, well, I'll have a Will Campbell story for you in a moment. Beauty as the foundation of morality, philosophy, ethics, education. Beauty. So Elaine Scarry says that at the heart of education is a willingness continually to revise one's own location in order to place oneself in the path of beauty. That's the basic impulse underlying education, the desire to place yourself in proximity to the beautiful. And of course, beauty, we're learners of beauty rather than knowers of beauty, learners of truth rather than copyright owners of truth, learners, if you believe in God, of God's righteousness. But even just plain old righteousness, we're learners of righteousness. And I would define righteousness as right relationship. And seeking first God's reign and God's righteousness within the Christian tradition is a life's work. It's not something that is ever exactly done, but that's not a downer or a shame spiral. It's about beauty. I'll mention the Will Campbell thing as well. Will Campbell, I don't know the context, but he told me the story of being invited to speak on capital punishment, and he was willing to do that. He was very much a prisoner's advocate, testified in court over and over again, Will Campbell. But in this context, he thought he was going to go and talk about lots of things, the death penalty among them. He gets there and he finds out that it's a debate, and he had not agreed to a debate. But the fellow who is pro-capital punishment is going to speak, and then it's going to be his turn. And the fellow spoke, and then Will went up. Fellow spoke for 5 minutes, and then Will went up and said, "I think it's tacky." And then he sat down. Like, that was all he said, "I think it's tacky." And that really was all he had. But then they're like, "Oh, no, come on, you got to explain." But essentially, he was saying, and he was one who said that if you really understand tragedy, it becomes very difficult to take sides. As in, taking the side of one person to the ultimate exclusion of the other person. And of course, Will Campbell was a student of Jesus of Nazareth, who said of the people who were torturing and executing him, according to one gospel, "Forgive them, they don't know what they're doing." So that idea of this person did this horrible, horrible thing, but at bottom they are more than that horrible thing that they're doing. So there's a whole anthropology to that. There's a whole way of living in the world with that. But so when Will says he thinks it's tacky, his argument is that it's an unbeautiful way to respond to tragedy, that it's an ugly way to respond to ugliness, and that there are, well, because Will believed that the love of God does not stop with any human evil, wickedness, action. He was really big on not playing God with that kind of decision. So that's my connection of Will Campbell to with this beauty question. Education as a willingness continually to revise. I wonder if we could do this with discipleship too, that discipleship or even faithfulness to a particular tradition is a commitment to continuously revise your own location in order to place yourself, your own life, your own words, your own actions in the path of beauty. This is to define education as a journey, certainly, but it's also to envision education as a creative task that involves finding and seeing beauty in the very places where we've grown accustomed to only seeing and sensing and feeling conflict. So I'll note too, in this determination to see beautifully, to recognize beauty, there's also, in my insistence on religion as non-optional, something of an insistence on nuance. Nuanced thinking, nuanced imagining of other people. I'll note when I grade people's papers, the word I write in the margins more than any other is probably nuance. I'm asking for more nuance in that argument, in that position, in that description of a poem or a historical event. And with that, we've still got lots of time, so let me just share a little bit more of this. And note that what we do, I've continued to think of a question from last week after I read the poem. Can you say what your name is, person of the amazing question? Mary? Upon hearing the poem, we may recall that Mary said, "How do we go from fear to connection?" Told you the story of the crackers and grape juice in the parking lot, where I had what I thought the Bible communicated clearly concerning my own deep, deep trouble if I didn't have communion every Sunday after my baptism. And I'll note, and I also kind of placed before you the word tradition and invited you to think of, well, for one thing, to think, when we think religion, religion is always a question of tradition. Which traditions are we talking about? And which so-called adherents of that tradition? Because obviously, there are people who call themselves Christian or advertise themselves as Christian, which many of us might want to say, "I see no deep continuity between your behavior and your speech and the teachings of Jesus of Nazareth." So I'm not sure that your self-description is true. And similarly, we have people who call themselves Muslims or get called Muslim, who most Muslims would say not Muslims, not at all. There is no adherence to Islam or the will of Allah in that action undertaken by people who called themselves Muslims. So religion, I mean, religion is so many, names so many things, but to ever speak of religion as if we always already know what we're talking about, I'm arguing against this. And I'm trying to place tradition as kind of a river. We did trader, trade, hand over. If one was to say, I love tradition, I want to say, which ones are you referring to? Because there is many a non-neighborly, there's even murderous activity that happens under the name of adherence to a particular tradition. But of course there's also righteous tradition out there. I'll note too, I'm going to bring the Bible into it again in a moment, but we know the story perhaps of somebody asking Jesus how he could enter into the life to come, the kingdom, and they talk about the commandments, which the guy knows, and then, well, what's the big one? And, well, you know, love God and love your neighbor. And then the guy who's looking to be justified says, well, who's my neighbor? And Jesus tells the story of the Good Samaritan. And we may recall, I won't read it out loud, but you've got the fellow on the side of the road who is ignored by the folks within the Jewish tradition that this particular interrogator was looking to hear lifted up. But then you have this third person who looks after the suffering, discarded, beaten down human being on the side of the road, and above and beyond, you know, paying for a hotel and all that kind of stuff. And after Jesus tells the story, he asks the man which one of those three was a neighbor. And the man can't even say Samaritan, because Samaritan is so beyond the pale of what was considered kosher in this conversation. But it was the Samaritan, it was this person on a tradition that supposedly isn't into righteousness at all, who was being the good neighbor. So, but on that, why do I mention this? Because this question of which tradition is really doing it, is really righteous, is a question that is at work even within the Bible. But I'll note of mine, back to this question of fear and connection. I have another anxiety story to share with you concerning my own attempt to get the tradition right. But I want to do the thing of I want to go from describing the fear, but noting too that I think I am just as connected to the tradition I was trying to bear witness to and be faithful to now as I was when I was wolfing down crackers and grape juice in a parking lot and when I delivered a particular sermon. So I'll note that Central Church of Christ, still there. Anyone ever darkened the door of Central Church of Christ in this room? You have darkened the door. Okay. I haven't in quite a while. But we were regulars when I was growing up. And we had an evening in which it was only men who were allowed to preach, and I was one of them. And I was asked to deliver a sermon. So I shared a quandary that I had. I believed that I did not have a shot at eternal salvation apart from being baptized, but I had a verse that was confusing to me in that regard, because I'm trying to make it all add up, trying to make it work. Did I tell you the Moses story in terms of trying to make it work? So in a Sunday school class, I'm reading, and I'm told that the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, is written by Moses, and I believe it, but I do note a possible problem with Moses writing it. Can anybody, oh, two of them actually. Can anybody guess what the problem was without having to pass up the microphone? Moses, well, for one thing, Moses, it says that he was the most humble man alive, And I thought, why would he write something like that if he was the most humble man alive? But the bigger one was Moses' own death is reported. So I asked my Sunday school teacher, what's up with that? How could Moses write about his own death? And my Sunday school teacher took a deep breath and said, well, I never said he enjoyed writing it. So now I have an image of Moses. What? Okay. So we had that kind of thing going all the time, but this one was a little more pressing. So you got to be baptized to go to heaven. But then I had this thing where Jesus kind of decrees salvation unto someone who definitely wasn't baptized. Maybe you know what I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of the thief on the cross. Right, so you have that, put in a good word for me, remember me in your kingdom, to which Jesus says, today you will be with me in paradise. So I'm in the tradition, and I'm wrestling with the tradition, and this seems to be a contradiction to me. So what do? I ask people, I poke around. I didn't have the internet to look it up on. But I offer what I take to be a pretty reasonable explanation, which is that this thief, if the Bible's all going to add up the way I think it has to, this thief must have been one of the multitudes of people who was baptized by John the Baptist earlier in the Gospels. And Jesus must have within his own mind a kind of built-in baptism scanner. And he can look and read it and know without even having to say it, like a barcode or something, like, you check out. So I'll note that for a few years there, that was my response to that, but I learned to read it a little more loosely, to read the Bible, to have my own doctrines challenged in some way, to have my own perceived have-tos undone by what's actually there. Does that make sense to everybody? And I think, not overcoming the idea that holding to a particular idea could ever sanctify me or make me right was part of it too. So it's the tradition. I wouldn't change my tradition, but I needed to grow within it. I needed to be transformed by the renewing of my mind, to draw from that verse in Romans. I needed to be alive to process. And I'm going to keep asking this. I hope it doesn't get annoying. But did I share the story of my grandfather and the kitchens last week? Churches, kitchens. Okay, I'm looking around, I'm thinking not. So my grandfather, and I can't recall who it was, but somebody came up afterwards and maybe knew my grandfather somewhere along the way. He was a math professor at Lipscomb, and he left Lipscomb because Lipscomb was becoming too liberal for him. Ended up at MTSU. He would receive Caesar's coin, but he would not take a Lipscomb salary if Lipscomb was, you will perhaps note a similar hang-up. Lipscomb, claiming to be Christian of the church, was a problem for him because he didn't think Lipscomb was Christian any longer. But go to a state school, we're all good. And similarly, so he believed that at the heart of Lipscomb was a false witness that he didn't want to be a part of anymore. It's rough. He would also start churches, and then if they wanted to build a bathroom, he was done. Because there's bathroom, excuse me, I'm sorry, I got that wrong. If they wanted to build a kitchen. But it applies to bathrooms as well. No kitchens in the Bible, so he founded, in a manner of speaking, a number of congregations, given this process. And once he said to my dad, listen, I play it this way because this is what I think God says. This is what I think the Bible, this is what biblical thinking is in my view. But if you ever find out I was wrong, move on. Which is kind of a beautiful thing, right? So I can't pretend that I see these passages as saying something other than what they're saying, but I know that I'm wrong in some ways. I, in fact, am banking on being wrong, and that you, son, will evolve in your understanding of the Scripture. So I'm trying to connect this a little bit to this fear connection thing. There was still a lot of fear going on, fear that I'm not content with, or living in response to. But connection where you can kind of trust, yeah, that we're all process in some way, process. Okay, let me get back to this here. Let me see, let me just consult my notes for a moment. Yeah, I'll say in my own reading of the Scripture, there was a time when I was suspicious of commentary and footnotes, as if they were a grossly human hindrance to God's direct communication with the reader. But I think of them now as a crucial means to not reading it, the Bible, or any sacred text, badly or even murderously, of reading it well and carefully and alive to context. Now, I didn't at the time. I thank God for footnotes, and as long as everyone's allowed to speak, I've yet to meet a Bible study I didn't like. Somewhere back there I was shown that the Bible, as a collection of very different texts, canonized as Scripture over time, should never be read flatly. Should never be read in such a way that I ignore an abolitionist text in the New Testament. I'm thinking Philemon. I'm thinking Paul saying in Christ, there's neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. I never want to ignore that emancipation proclamation in the New Testament in the name of the curse of Ham or the curse of Canaan in Genesis. Never read it flatly. Always let it, well, I wouldn't say in my own reading of the Bible, I would resist suggesting that God, that ultimately God changes, but I would definitely say that the biblical conception of God, the biblical vision of God changes in the collection. You have it, sorry to get into this, it becomes like a Bible class, but you have in the passage in Hebrews, Abraham by faith, Moses by faith. All by faith, people began, they were true with what they believed of God and knew of God, but there is an evolution. For one thing, so that Gentiles are eventually a part of the covenant kind of thing. I'm just trying to elaborate on the let's not read the Bible flatly. If you use a passage in 2 Chronicles to ignore a teaching of Jesus in Matthew, you're reading it flatly. Or if you read a command to slay the Edomites in an early Old Testament text, if you use that to avoid Isaiah saying, let's study war no more, let's beat our swords into plowshares, you're reading the Old Testament flatly. So one thing I've done with my understanding of this tradition, which I still would like to think I'm an adherent of, is be alive to the process. But more on this. I just said it. Let's not read it flatly, as if a decree to slay Edomites in one verse can be rightly used to counter the prophetic call to provide for a foreigner or to love an enemy in another. Or as if there is no movement, development, or ethical evolution within the collection itself. The biblical tradition, to which I try to remain true, contains traditions within itself that appeal to one another, counter one another, and sometimes even leave one another behind. And I'm noting Jesus would say, you have heard that it was said, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. But I say unto you, do not resist an evildoer, love your enemy, that kind of thing. So Jesus and the prophets are always pulling that little pivot of, you once heard it said this, but behold, I am doing a new thing, saith the Lord. So any tradition, this is kind of this work of not viewing religion as one, just one thing. You got to break it down into traditions, and we need to note that the traditions change. One way of putting this, you can't step in the same religion twice. It's always moving, always mobile. And what do we mean? I know that I deal with this. If somebody says, sounds like you're a Christian, I want to say, I welcome that, but you tell me what you think a Christian is, and I'll tell you if I think that your description describes me. Why not, especially since we're not on television and we don't have to answer really quick, why not slow it down and figure out what we mean by these words? Not just Christian, but conservative, liberal, all of these things. We can always do that. We can always slow down. We can always say, I need a moment before I offer a response to the question that you just put to me. Weirdly enough, committing myself to it, the text, in spirit and in truth, means to hold fast to movement, to receptivity, to new and unforeseen goodness on the horizon, to what, according to the tradition, the Spirit of God might have to say in this reading of this sacred text. And I think in order to have a little back and forth, I am going to stop there and see if anybody has anything. But if we run out of people with questions and comments, I have more material that I can draw from. So I'm going to go get that microphone. And it is on. And here I come. This feels like Donahue suddenly. But I welcome it. I also have a, we'll see how we do on time. I have a poem that I'll either share with you next week or now. We will see. So I'm going to pass this on over.
You spoke of your grandfather and his, is this on?
I think it is on, yes.
And his adherence to the Bible and what was in it. No kitchens in the Bible, so if you want to build a kitchen in this church, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Would you say that your grandfather was worshiping the Bible instead of worshiping the living God as he understood who God was?
Okay. I want to be, okay, is it on? Is this working? Yes, okay. I don't want, when Jesus says, and Jesus isn't the only one who says it, when any sacred tradition warns us against judging, judge not lest ye be judged, I think that means don't judge. I think it means, so I'm going to try not to do that, but I think my grandfather, like me, is in danger of mistaking my own read as what the Bible's saying. The pitfalls of interpretation will always be that I miss the deepest meaning because I decide too quickly that I know what's going on. We do that with people. Oh, there's this horrible thing that we say to people sometimes. When someone will say something and will say, oh, so what you're saying is, and I'm trying to dramatize a kind of aggression in that, what you're saying is, and then we say what we think they're saying, and hopefully that's not the end of it. Hopefully we're able to say, that's what I think you're saying. Would you like to tell me that that's not what you mean? We do this with meaning all the time. It takes two to mean all the time. We have our intent. We say, I didn't mean that, or you're misconstruing what I said, as if my intention and the impact of what I'm saying are always going to be the same. It's a conversation. The Bible is a conversation in so many ways. I think that my grandfather, especially if his personality was such that toward the end of his life, he didn't have a lot of people who could question him and say, you know what, I think that you read that wrong. My hope would be that he had mentors, teachers every step of the way, but I think he often made it hard for anyone to ever dare to disagree with him on something. And so I think he, like the rest of us, like me, often mistook his own interpretation as the only definitive meaning of the verse. So he did that thing which many of us do. And it's going to sound like I'm making a bit of a joke, but I'm not. Many of us mistake the voice in our heads for the voice of God. Many of us, I mean, it's formidable, but it's the case. Many of us mistake the voice in our heads for the voice of God. How do we not do that? It takes a community. It takes relationships with people who know that they won't be struck down or responded to with anger if they try to disagree with us. So sometimes in my conversation habits, I'll say something, I maybe done it just now, and say, how does that strike you? What do you think? Can I put it another way? And I'm inviting, hopefully, my daughter, my wife, my mom, whomever, to say, you know what, I really don't like the sound of what you just said, or I think that you're missing it in some way. But was my grandfather often possibly guilty of a kind of bibliolatry, where he took his own read as the living Word of God? Certainly. At downtown, we're at Second Pres more than downtown Pres lately, but when we do our Old Testament and New Testament readings, we'll say, listen for the word of the Lord, before we read it out loud. And within that is the idea that the living Word is going to be larger, bigger, more cutting, and maybe even more comforting than anything we're going to be able to conceive with our minds. Does that speak a little to it? Okay, so we'll go over to you now.
Earlier on you were talking about labels.
Yes.
And generalizations, and it came to my mind that surely there are exceptions to the rule of labels and generalizations, such as calling people deplorable,
yeah,
or calling somebody an idiot.
Yeah.
You know, surely there is a place for those types of responses.
Okay. Well, I will say something, but I will also invite back and forth on that. Surely there's a place, I feel that, and yet, also from my Church of Christ background, once my dad, we were told to never speak the word shut up in my house. It was forbidden. Big deal. So one time when my dad did tell me to shut up, it was pretty traumatic. He apologized, but it was like, oh gosh, all order is gone. The person from whom the commandment to never say shut up came just told me to shut up. But then later on, he called his brother, I won't say it, I'll almost say it. He called him an a-hole, right? In a moment of anger, he called him an a-hole, we will say. And he approached me within 24 hours of that, really, oh, I can't believe he said that, and said, do you think that I was wrong to call him that? And I said, well, you could have said, you're choosing to act like that. Or, for whatever reason, you are playing the role of an a-hole right now. And even in that, now, so I have my, we could call it Church of Christ hang-ups, but I also have this attentiveness to language that I think is right. I mean, I think that it's a call. So I can't recall if this came up last week, but I teach in prisons. And I have people who have done, I got out of the habit of Googling them when I got home to find out why they were there. I decided that was wrong to do it. But I did do it for a while. And often my students will tell me their stories. And often their stories are always tragic, in the women's prison especially, almost down to a person. If there was an act of violence that landed them there, it was an act of violence that was largely retaliatory or done out of self-defense, but the timing was such that it couldn't quite be called, he was about to shoot me when I took him out. So all manner of tragedy, all manner of actions that would seem to merit, this is what you are, for the incarcerated people in my life. And a general rule of thumb there that I might have picked up from Will Campbell is no one is only the worst decision they ever made. No one is only the worst decision they ever made. So to say of, I'll say it again, no one is only the worst decision they've ever made. And I carry that with me when I try to avoid, with whoever it is that I'm tempted to demonize, suggesting that's all they are. Now, we are our actions. We are the sum total of what we're up to, what we say, and what we do. But even in that worst case scenario, well, it was Martin Luther King who said that the image of God is never totally gone in a person, which is what made it possible for King and John Lewis and James Lawson and any number of people within the civil rights era to look at the people who were threatening to kill them, who were spitting on them, all that kind of thing, and to insist, I know that I'm not looking at the whole of who you are, even as you're saying that you want me dead, kind of thing. There seems to be a sacred intuition at work there as well. Does that speak to it to a degree? Yeah, so, but it's also kind of a verbal hang-up to a degree too. Yes?
A couple of questions. One is there a way to look at, is there a standard with which to evaluate if someone is allowing their beliefs to lead them to actions that are not consistent with their beliefs? For instance, that their beliefs are causing them to be unloving to other people.
Mm-hmm.
And is there a way to bring someone to a realization of where they are in a good way?
Yes.
Another way to put that without getting a loving way or Christian
Yeah.
way, I'd say. But
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Well, there's accountability. There's a community when one is, and I'm sorry to, because the Christian tradition is my, is the Kool-Aid on which I was raised, we could say. I am going to be defaulting to that when explaining these things, but there's all manner of accountability within every tradition. There's communities. In Buddhism, there's a Sangha. That is the community of people who are following the teachings of the Buddha. Within Christian tradition, there's baptism, and when you're baptized, supposedly, as I understand it, you are saying to that community, I sign up, and if I fail to follow the teachings of Jesus and the prophets in the way I pay my employees, in the way I talk about my enemies, in the way I do business, then I need you to approach me. Oh goodness, and there's a system in place in Matthew 18 that if you believe that you see somebody doing something like that, you go to them and talk to them. And if they keep resisting, you bring another person along, and that other person supposedly, and this could be done between people of, and this could be an interfaith activity just in terms of trying to be upright people who are seeking justice and the good. You bring another person along and you perhaps find out, you know what, you're wrong. There was no foul there. Sorry. Oh, you're right. The three of you work it out. But then we have within the Christian tradition, excommunicate. Oh, you bring it to the assembly, the ecclesia, but then you have, and if everyone's decided, you know what, you can't do that and call yourself a part of this community, there's excommunication, which isn't God hates you now. It's just for the possibility of a faithful witness to the world, we're going to have to stop pretending that you're involved in the practice of this church type thing. And then the thing that first occurred to me was there's exorcism. And I didn't mean that to be heavy. I meant that to be kind of funny, but also, oh, and I'm going to show you in it what I think is an exorcism next week. It's not what you think it is. It's Fred Rogers' Senate testimony, which I do think of as a soft exorcism, where you're, how are we doing on time right now? Are we?
About 5 minutes.
5 minutes.
Okay, I think I'm going to take this as a sign that I need to pass out this poem, because the poem, to my mind, describes, I don't know that this poem has ever been called an exorcism, but it does speak to this, how do you do it? How do you approach people? You do tell people, I think, that they aren't being a living witness to the tradition that they ascribe, and that can be done in many different ways, writing letters. But we do live in a day in which what we call flip-flopping, this sacred traditions call repentance. So there is a resistance to anything that is discernibly repenting. Greek for repentance is metanoia. It's turning your mind around. And I think we are in a culture these days where you never back down. It's considered career suicide or something. Okay, wait a minute, I got to pull these out. Sorry for this. Here we go, and I will ask, I'm going to read it, and let me read it first, if you don't mind. I know we only have 5 minutes, but let me read it, and then we'll discuss it next week. The word dike is in here, referring to a broken dike, like a dam. So be ready for dike. But other than that, all of the words are going to be clear to you. I think this is called a ritual to read to each other. And I guess what I'll do is maybe I'll read it out loud, and then that will be done. And I'll mention, if anybody wanted a book, I do have more, if anybody wants one. Here's the poem. Here's the poem. So hard to segue between those two. Buy my book if you want. And now a poem. I apologize for that was not at all a seamless transition. Here we go. If you don't know the kind of person I am, and I don't know the kind of person you are, a pattern that others made may prevail in the world, and following the wrong God home, we may miss our star. For there is many a small betrayal in the mind, a shrug that lets the fragile sequence break, sending with shouts the horrible errors of childhood storming out to play through the broken dike. And as elephants parade, holding each elephant's tail, but if one wanders, the circus won't find the park, I call it cruel, and maybe the root of all cruelty, to know what occurs but not recognize the fact. And so I appeal to a voice, to something shadowy, a remote, important region in all who talk. Though we could fool each other, we should consider, lest the parade of our mutual life get lost in the dark. For it is important that awake people be awake, or a breaking line may discourage them back to sleep. The signals we give, yes or no or maybe, should be clear. The darkness around us is deep. Okay, so this is kind of a heavy poem. Normally I read it twice and then I pass it out and we talk, but in the interest of time, we'll pass it out, and here, I'll give it to you to pass out. And I'll maybe read it again next week and we'll talk about it. But I feel like it's called a ritual to read to each other, and I sometimes wish I had a ritual to read to each other colored glasses on at all times, because it's there's just a way of responding to people at work in this poem. William Stafford. And there's a description of who William Stafford was at the top. And with that, I'm really excited about next week. And I'll mention I respond to emails, and I know that I'm available to talk about anything between now and then. Thank y'all for listening to me.